Jamie, Bethan, can I first of all thank you for those very warm words of welcome and clearly a great deal of detail. And Bethan, you will note that there is a recurring pattern in my career. I did lose a lot of 800-meter races. It would be remiss of me not to, Lynn Davis, who was, having carbon dated me and taken me back to the 1972 English Schools Championships, I think it's probably only fair to carbon date the great Lynn Davis, who was my team manager in Moscow in 1980 and in 1984, and is a tribute to great tailoring. Well done, Lynn. You've lasted remarkably well. Laura, can I first apologise for not being here for the entirety of your speech? I had a slight problem on the train, and it did remind me of a more searing moment in the early days of the bid, when to show cross-party support, which was absolutely essential for the delivery of the Games, and given that the main focus of this conference is about legacy, I hope the same spirit that can be maintained throughout the next 10 years, where we really can deliver on everything we saw last summer. It was decided that I would introduce Ken Livingstone in 2004, a year from the Games, to the Conservative Party conference that year up in Blackpool. And having spent probably about a week figuring out what it was I was going to say to 500 Conservatives at a fringe meeting that wouldn't immediately clear the room straight away, in introducing Ken, I got to the platform and started to speak. And Ken has many great skill sets. Timekeeping is not one of them. And having spoken for the best part of 10 minutes about the bid in its early days, the inevitable happened. One of his private secretaries came up, stuck a note in front of me to say that there was a delay, and 10 minutes became 20 and 20 became 30. And after about 45 minutes, there was really nothing more I could say about this bid at this stage. And mercifully, the doors flew open at the back of the hotel. I think it was the Imperial. Ken ran up the aisle, grabbed the microphone out of my hand, and to 500 Conservatives sitting there, introduced himself with the wonderful words, "I'm sorry I'm late, don't blame me. I didn't privatise the railways." Laura, I'm not quite going that far this morning. It is just to say that I'm sorry that I wasn't here for the beginning of your speech, although I did pick up, I think, the key and core thrusts. You provided one observation and posed one question. The observation was that 10% of the Premier League, I think this was for Keith Mills's advantage as a director of Tottenham, is now Wales. I would point out for Keith's benefit that 90% of his goals last year came out of Wales. So I'm delighted as a Chelsea fan to point that out to him. And also to say that you asked for people to really help drive the Welsh language bill, the Welsh language. Well, in 1994, having been a Member of Parliament for about a year and a half, and having voted on probably 3 or 4 occasions against my government on fishing policy, days at sea and bycatch and Sector 7 and mackerel boxes, which Wales and Cornwall, the constituency I represented, all share, I was put onto the Welsh language bill. And when I got there, I realised that this wasn't just about the Welsh language bill. It was really about the rehabilitation of offenders, because pretty much everybody that had ever voted against the government was put onto that bill, which I sat on for nearly 2 or 3 weeks, and know actually probably a great deal more about the nature of the Welsh language. I don't speak it, but it was a very interesting moment in my political career. I know that we're slightly running behind time, so let me sort of pull a few thoughts together in advance of the Q&A. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted for so many reasons, because when we set out on this extraordinary journey, I sensed one very important factor, and that was that we couldn't simply talk about the Games as something that would affect only a small part of London, East London, 500 acres of extraordinary transformation that we've witnessed, that the project would be unsustainable over that 7-year period if we weren't able to capture and galvanize across all our nations and regions the vision. And I know that from, in a way, my own background. I'm an odd animal, really. I was born in London. I was partly educated in the West Midlands. I then moved to the People's Republic of South Yorkshire at the age of 11 and was brought up in Sheffield. I then went to Loughborough University. I represented a Cornish constituency. My grandfather is Indian, so I tend not to see the world through the wrong end of a telescope from within the M25. And I think I picked up on the point as I came into the room that you made, and it is such an essential point, that we really do need to capture over the next 10 years the same spirit of collaboration and contribution across sort of networked space that we did in the 3 years of winning the right to stage the games. And let me pay tribute here to Sir Keith Mills, who set off with that vision many years earlier than most of us. Sir Craig Reedy, back in the mid-90s, saw on behalf of the National Olympic Committee the importance of coming together for a bid. We'd had one bid with Birmingham, two with Manchester, and then bringing London to the table. So this has been a long journey. And it's probably worth it's barely credible that it is only 40 weeks ago since we were witnessing those scenes that we saw in the summer of 2012, both Olympic and Paralympic. And I'm sure if Keith and Craig before him and me a year and a half after Keith got involved, if we all sat down and looked at where that journey took us to the opening ceremony of the Games with 8,500 people in an organising committee, a broader workforce across London and the UK of nearly 300,000, of which 100,000 were contractors, the melding into that space of 70,000 volunteers that were the toast of cities around the world, but reflected communities diverse and creative around the United Kingdom. A project that put £6.5 billion worth of construction business into the UK economy at a time when most constructors will tell you there was precious little going on, jobs not just created but safeguarded, and many of those in Wales. If we looked narrowly at the transformation of East London with those 8 permanent venues, but now houses and homes for East Londoners going forward, sport venues that will host some of the best sport we will see over the next 10 years, schools, a hospital, an extraordinary opportunity to grab the imagination of young people in that area and drive all those educational and social ambitions that we know that sport gets to. 19.8 million people across our nations involved in a cultural Olympiad, a torch relay that touched 90% of the population, 8,000 miles, 8,000 torch bearers, and those 70,000 volunteers narrowed down from 350,000 by CV and then interviews across 100,000 to get those 70,000. I don't think the three of us would have said that when we set out on that journey, that was what was on the beer mat or the restaurant menu. It wasn't. We hoped that we would get somewhere near that. But at the end of that, across all our nations, I think we've seen modern, diverse, competent and creative communities that came together under an exceptional set of circumstances to forge a national vision. And we've also seen communities that have been proud of their history, protective of their heritage, and extraordinarily welcoming to the world, bearing in mind, and I remember this very clearly, that actually, of course, the first Olympic event that took place was at the Millennium Stadium, which was the first day, literally the first day of the football, on the morning of the dress rehearsal of the opening ceremony. So actually Wales did kick the games off. And to answer another of your questions, who can forget that rugby moment in the Millennium Stadium? There are a few of us in this room that are working quite hard on that. So it is just to say that if you look at where we started and look where we ended up, it was an extraordinary journey. Much is spoken about legacy, and it's one of those words that sort of, in a way, has so many different meanings and so many different connotations for so many different people. I could probably ask everybody in this room their view about legacy, and they could all, with some justification and some intellectual rigor, come up with their own specific and detailed definition. In a way, for me, the first legacy, the strongest legacy, had to be the delivery of a successful Games. I think it would have been a very tough task for organisations like the ones represented in this room here today, and let me place on record, because there are so many of you that helped get this whole project across the line. I've often been quoted as saying that no organising committee alone can ever deliver the complexity of this project, the thousands of moving parts that have to be melded into that vital ingredients that goes to make up a successful Games. And it would be invidious of me to identify specific groups or individuals, but you know who you are, and you really did help us, particularly at a time when, as Laura said, there were a few naysayers out there, when it wasn't that easy or popular to stick your heads above the parapet and say this was worth going for. And really to look at the first part of that legacy as being the successful delivery of a successful Games. I think it would have been difficult in here for all of you to go back into your communities and galvanise and excite people about the next 10 years of that journey had what we witnessed last summer been a damp squib of an event. I'm not going to go, Bethan or Jamie, quite as far as to say it was the most successful Games ever, but I love that sentiment. And I will relay your confidence and acclamation to all our teams back in London. But just to say that it was important that we got this right last year, not simply because we wanted the athletes to light up the stadiums. We did want them to be a catalytic force for the inspiration that the Minister a few moments talked about, the role models that can be created. You know, when David Brailsford talks about 500,000 more people regularly cycling between 2008 and 2012, it's not simply because public policy has drifted or nudged people towards cycling. It's the extraordinary impact that people like Victoria Pendleton and Chris Hoy and all those great cyclists have had on communities. I will go to my grave knowing that the greatest driver of sports participation is the well-stocked shop window. That's not to say you only fund excellence, but it is to say that if you want that inspiration so often comes from people who have done the most extraordinary things in their local communities, but at an international level. And that's why it's so important to go on bidding and creating these great opportunities through events. One of the most popularly asked questions I get in and around legacy is, well, you know, how is it going to be delivered? And the simple answer is it's going to be delivered by you. I think that we have the ingredients in place. I think we have the red carpet in front of us. I think we have a platform that very few countries have had. I think that we're not talking about legacy as something that has just sort of dropped into our laps. If I go back to the organising committee, I know that when Keith and myself and the teams were looking at how we were going to create a bid, legacy sat absolutely at the centre, whether it was about design and after use of those venues, whether it was about how we could use legacy sustainable environmental construction to leave a community that goes on delivering the things that we wanted it to deliver, whether it was about putting things in place, even the master plan that was in place a year after we won the right to stage the Games, had legacy enshrined in it. I was just come back from the IOC's Association of National Olympic Committee meetings in Lausanne this weekend. Time and time again, including the president of the IOC, Jacques Rogge, the chairman of the Coordination Commission in London, Denny Oswald, the president of the Association of National Olympic Committees, Sheikh Al-Sabah, all three, and consistently throughout the conference, other delegates talked about the way that London, the UK, enshrined legacy at the very beginning of this journey. And Laura, you made absolutely the right point, that the most demanding stakeholder that any of us have is not government, it's not the mayor's office, it's not the 205 National Olympic Committees or the 170 Paralympic committees. It wasn't the London boroughs, it wasn't all those sporting organisations, it wasn't our sponsors, it wasn't the International Olympic Committee or the International Paralympic Committee or those raft of agencies that help get us across the line. The most demanding stakeholder any of us have are, of course, the people that live in our communities, because they don't just simply accept that sport is the great celebration of the best athletes of their generation coming together. They ask much tougher and more demanding questions. If during a bid process you are saying that you want to use the games to inspire more young people to take up sport, they are more likely than not to ask you, how are you going to do that? If you talk about the construction of venues and using those venues to develop community-based sport, they want to know how you're going to do it. They want to know what is the chain of custody between the social and the economic tenancy partners. They want to know these questions. They are much, much more demanding. 30 years ago, it would have been very much easier for people like myself and Keith to have simply stood up and say, well, we just want to bring the best athletes of their generation to our city or to our country, and the rest falls into place. Well, they know actually on balance, it doesn't. And they know from the experience of previous major events, that doesn't always happen. It doesn't happen simply because we wish it to happen. And that is why when I was sitting on that wonderful evening, Super Saturday, celebrating, and I will be parochial for a moment, a great night of history for UK track and field with Greg Rutherford and Mo Farah and Jess Ennis all winning their Olympic titles within about an hour and 10 minutes of each other. I also had the Prime Minister, who was sitting on my right-hand side, who in the middle of that celebration asked me what I thought about legacy and what we needed to do. And I sort of answered the question, and clearly competently enough, because at the end of the evening I seemed to have ended up with the job. So the broader point is that this is not something that we're now needing to just come to and deal with, because actually in all our communities, across government now, across all our sporting agencies, across our national governing bodies, even those sponsors that came to the table that were probably as responsible for some of their activation programs that touched many of the legacy issues that we're talking about, we are now in a very good place to go on building on legacy. It's not an entirely unfurrowed field here. We have got some really good, smart things in place. My gut instinct is for those things to come together. We need to enable local communities to go on doing what they're doing. My journeys domestically since the Games have been very encouraging, whether I've been up in Scotland or today in Wales, where I'll be seeing some really smart projects after this session, or down in the southwest of England or Leicestershire just recently. These things are happening, and they're happening not simply because of the Games, but they have been turbocharged. Local communities have taken charge in the way that they did during the Games. They have gone back to those communities to figure out exactly what it is that we can most make the value from off the back of last summer. And in a way, it's an interesting one for me, because when I started off on this journey, people would tell me, well, you know, this is really just about London and people won't get it if they live outside London. I don't think I'm breaching any confidences when I say that actually some of the greatest creativity I saw was the further you went from London, because it was very clear and we had to be open about it. If you're sitting on the 11 islands off the coast of, you know, the Western Scotland, the chances of those communities being in those venues was very limited. So what are the kind of things that you needed to do to make this relevant and have traction in those communities? 11 islands came together to have a primary school sport Olympic Games. We looked over the fact that you probably shouldn't have used the word Olympic Games, but we thought that would be a bit churlish. I used to complain sitting on the M25 going off to North London to train that I was caught up in traffic. Some of these kids were setting off for Lewis at 2:30 in the morning on ferries, and then at the end of the session in the morning, all crammed into a school hall to go onto the internet and websites and Skyping to talk about Olympic values to all those kids that didn't make it to those championships in their own school halls dotted across 11 islands. It was an extraordinary scene. That's the kind of creativity we've seen. And I don't believe communities are going to go back and say, well, that's just a one-off. I think they will want to enshrine that. So the importance of the legacy unit, which was really there to help government think a little more coherently, for instance, in resolving one of the issues around primary school sport. First time in my political career to be sitting around a table with the Secretary of State from Health, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Secretary of State from the Cabinet Office, and of course the Secretary of State for Education and Science, actually figuring out that if we're talking about childhood obesity, we're talking about the physical literacies, Laura, that you talked about, we're talking about getting more young people playing sport. This isn't a siloed approach across a little sliver of government. It has to come together in a coordinated way. And I think that is the future direction. Plus the fact we do need to hold on to this as a cross-party approach. It is really important. That is how we delivered the games, and that is how I genuinely believe legacy will be delivered. We cannot allow this to get tribal, and we do need it to be enshrined. So this is really a 20-year journey. 2 or 3 years to win the right to stage the games, 7 hard years of Herculean, unremitting work to get it across the line, with millions of people across the UK helping us. And now 10 years to really capture the essence of everything we saw last year, whether it's in increased participation rates, whether it is going on challenging public misconceptions about disability through the Paralympic Games, whether it's using the spiritual value that we saw with the games makers, with our join-in events over the coming few weeks, making sure that that volunteer ethic is not lost and that we really can get more people working in the third sector, certainly supporting narrowly in my field more sports, community-based sports clubs. Whether it's about business opportunities, it has to make sense that those companies that were seen successfully delivering chunks of a successful games will be preeminently positioned to win more business in that space. And already there are about 60 contracts that have been won by businesses, UK businesses in and around Sochi, about £120 million worth of contracts already being let around the Rio Games, and already with the World Cup in Russia in 2018, British businesses have already booked about £20 million worth of business. So we need to make sure we go on driving the ability of UK businesses to win the right to stage, to win more business around those types of events, and I see no reason why we shouldn't do that. Very good example, Australian businesses in 2008 booked about $1 billion worth of consultancy around the Beijing Games, and that's 8 years after their successful games in Sydney. So we really should be able to drive that. And finally, we want to go on making sure that those communities in East London that are now living in a landscape transformed through sport, and I'm very proud that sport has done that, continue to grow and to prosper, and for us to be able to use sport in communities the length and breadth of all our nations and regions in exactly the same way. So, Laura, that's about as quick a romp across the landscape as I can give you this morning. I'm looking forward to taking part in the panel discussions in a few moments, but thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to all of you in this room for helping make last year as special as it was. I'm really very, very grateful for your help and your support and the work that you did in all your communities to capture particularly the imagination of young people around the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Thank you.